Well, there once was an important servant to God, and he was given great responsibility, and he had the authority that he needed to fulfill that responsibility. He was a leader near the very top, and it appears that he was over many other servants of God. He was incredibly influential, and he was described as perfect and wise and beautiful. But in time, he stopped being a servant. He came to put his will before the will of God. He chose to rebel against God and serve himself. Instead of serving the light, he now chose darkness. His nature changed so much that he was given a new name. And before this change, he was called Lucifer. And afterwards, he became known as Satan. He went from being the bringer of light to the adversary. There was a choice that he made. It was a choice to put himself and his desires first. And people who choose this way of life that he does propagate and broadcast across the world, they are destined for destruction. Well, brother, I wanted to present this message in the sense of being a servant of God means putting God's will first always, and focusing on being a servant helps us to make the right choice when we find ourselves encountered with temptation that leads to life. So why do we sin? And what are the mechanics of the moment when we choose right and when we choose wrong? Understanding those moments, understanding the situations when we make the right choice consistently and when we struggle to make the right choice consistently can help us tremendously to understand how to overcome sin. If we can recognize how we make the choices, it will help us to make godly decisions. If you'll turn to Ezekiel 28 very briefly, that's something there I wanted to point out here. Now, in September, Mr. D'Alessandro did give a sermon where he explored how Lucifer made the transition to becoming the adversary. So I won't be repeating that, but I do want to establish a couple of points before moving forward. Because Satan's sin, it's like the source of most of the sin that we see in the world around us and the challenge that we have as well with sin. So Ezekiel 28, verse 16, obviously, well, I should say this is a prophecy addressed to the king of Tyre, but we know from the content that it does speak of Lucifer and Satan as well. So verse 16. By the abundance of your trading, you became filled with violence within, and you sinned. Therefore, I cast you as a profane thing out of the mountain of God, and I destroyed you, O covering cherub, from the midst of fiery stones. Your heart was lifted up because of beauty. You corrupted your wisdom for the sake of splendor. So as Mr. D'Alessandro did point out, sin starts in the heart. And that is exactly what we see here in verse 16. You became filled with violence within. It's in the heart where it started. The very next line says, and you sinned. So sin starts within the heart. And it's true for mankind as well. That's where it starts. It starts with our desires. Still talking about Lucifer, it says that his beauty led to vanity, pride. That's what it was. He took pride in his beauty, and suddenly his pride was stronger than the value system that he had. Because the very next line that I actually have in my notes here, I'm calling out the fact that his vanity caused him to choose to corrupt his wisdom. And that can be done. If your wisdom tells you, if you've learned something, and you know that a particular path is right, and you choose to a different path, and you do this consistently over time, you forget that that was the right path. You now believe that the wrong path is the right path. And that is what Satan did. He chose to take the values that he had and change them to allow him to go in a wrong direction. He knew that his vanity was wrong, or he wouldn't have had to have corrupted his wisdom, right? So he knew it was wrong before he actually corrupted the wisdom. He made a choice, changed his values. So he had to change the wisdom that he had. So let's get into what this looks like for us when that choice comes to us. We know that sin, in Romans at one point, sin, we know that the definition there in the Greek talks about missing the mark, right? Well, one of the things is if you don't know what the mark is, you don't have a hope of meeting the mark, of actually hitting it. You have to know what that particular mark is. And so in order to know what the mark is, it's required that you have to study God's word. You have to know what he teaches. Now, I won't get into a lot of it, but I'm going to go to Deuteronomy 30. If you'll turn to Deuteronomy 30, we're going to see how Moses presented it to the ancient Israelites. Because the question is, do we trust God or do we trust our own judgment when it's contrary to what God has taught? At some point, Lucifer chose to follow his own judgment, changed his values, changed his wisdom, allowed pride to drive a change in him so that he was now the adversary. He became Satan. And I'm certain that when Adam and Eve were in the Garden of Eden, that they trusted God when they received the instruction of don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. I'm sure that they trusted him when he said that. But when the moment of testing came, that trust was no longer held. That they didn't no longer, the trust that I'm sure they had when that was first told was no longer with them when the moment of the test came. So they relied on their own judgment and they made the wrong choice. All right, Deuteronomy 30, verse 15. After going through the law again, remember Deuteronomy is the second telling of the law. In verse 15, Moses says, see, I have set before you today good, death, and I have set before you today life and good, death and evil. It's a choice. In that I command you today to love the Lord your God, to walk in his ways and to keep his commandments, his statutes, his judgments. This is choice A. This is the godly way, keeping God's commandments, his statutes, and his judgments. Why? That you may live and multiply, and that the Lord will bless you in the land that you go to possess. But if your heart turns away, as it did with Lucifer, if your heart turns away so that you will not hear and are drawn away and worship other gods and serve them, we'll skip down to verse 19 real quick. Verse 19, then I call heaven and earth as witnesses against you today, that I have set before you life and death. Moses says he set life and death before them. How did he set life? He shared God's commandments and statutes and judgments. These lead to life. And how did he set death before them? He calls it out. It starts in the heart, right? That's what he said in verse 17. But if your heart turns away so you do not hear. So the death, it starts in the heart. It starts with the desires. Continuing in verse 19, or I'll back up just a little bit. I call heaven and earth as witnesses today against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore choose life, that both you and your descendants may live, that you may love the Lord your God, that you may obey his voice, and that you may cling to him, for he is your life, and the length of your days, and that you may dwell in the land which the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and Jacob, to give them. We know that all of mankind, after Christ came and suffered his death, all of mankind will be invited to this family. So let's go to James. I want to quote a few things from James here. James 1. I want to dig a little bit deeper into that matter of the heart, because that's really what Moses is talking about here. And that's what we've already identified. That's where sin starts. That is where Lucifer went wrong. So let's dig into the heart a little bit. James 1. Now, I always remember when I think about these things that sometimes people say, the 10 Commandments were just physical. They weren't about the heart. And yet all of this, anytime somebody goes astray from the 10 Commandments, it starts in the heart. All right, James 1, verse 14. But each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires. It's the heart. And enticed. It happened with Lucifer and before he became Satan, And it's the same way that men fall today, men and women. Verse 15, then when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. Starts in the heart, becomes desire, now it's sin. And when sinful growth that is full grown, brings forth death. It's the same thing that Moses said. Here at the end of the New Testament as well, being given to us by James. Verse 13, who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show by his good conduct that his works are done in meekness of wisdom. Remember the problem with Lucifer that we talked about. His wisdom became corrupted over his pride, which was initiated by his vanity in his own beauty. It was like a chain, apparently, as the book of Ezekiel lays it out. So here we're talking about godly wisdom, right? And that there should be meekness with wisdom. Wisdom could easily become something that people become very prideful about. So meekness of wisdom makes a great deal of sense here. Verse 14, but if you have bitter envy and self-seeking in your hearts, do not boast and lie against the truth. We've often said that this is about the give way of life, not the get way of life. Satan is about the get way of life. So we are not self-seeking. We are not to be self-seeking. We are to learn to adopt a give way of life. Verse 15, this wisdom does not descend from above. It's earthly, sensual, and demonic. Verse 16, and then I just want to call it out. What he's talking about there is the bitter envy and the self-seeking. All right, verse 16, for where envy and self-seeking exist, confusion and every evil thing are there. But the wisdom that is above is first pure, then peaceable, it's gentle, it's willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits. It's without partiality and without hypocrisy. There is nothing in that verse that describes what Lucifer became. There is nothing there that we should not have within ourselves. We need to be growing in these areas. In verse 18, now the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. It's hard to read these verses without thinking about the Beatitudes, right? Blessed are the peacemakers, for theirs will be the kingdom of God. Well, brethren, in conclusion, there was once a human servant of God. And at first, he was on the wrong path, and his heart was lifted up with pride, and was focused on the self. And in time, a new way was revealed that required turning aside onto a narrow path full of challenges, but with a great reward. Instead of serving the darkness, he chose to serve light. He weighed the cost and committed himself to this new way with a new master. And as his life passed, he grew and he flourished, learning how to overcome temptation and sin, emulating his master. And when his master returned, he was given great responsibility and made a servant to fulfill that responsibility with many other servants of God. And his nature changed so much that he was given a new name. Brethren, when temptation comes, let's be sure to choose life. Let's choose the tree of life.